Okay, so for this first part of the explanation, I'm just gonna dive right in. And some of you who may be new to the channel, specifically after watching Charlie's video, may not be used to this certain style, and may demand immediate evidence after hearing such far-out concepts. But if you're patient, after explaining the main premise of Tartaria and what we're even discussing, we can go into more detail and provide supporting arguments after the initial brief explanation. Tartaria is the biggest conspiracy, meaning it's not an officially approved narrative, yet in terms of the implications and magnitude of the topics covered and the cognitive dissonance associated with it is so great, it could be rightfully considered the largest conspiracy. Essentially, it all begins with all our taught history being, for the most part, a lie. So much so that it's mind-numbing to even fathom. Sure, there are likely some truths sprinkled in there. I'm not saying that everything that has happened has been faked, but more likely that it was set up to play out in a specific way. What Tartaria boils down to is fabricated histories in stolen cities. For example, what if I was to tell you that New York, Chicago, or any other major United States American city for that matter, was not built in the manner that they tell us, and was actually already here in America before the European settlers? Imagine that our cities are just recycled. That would be too crazy, right? What proof is there to support such a claim? In order to demonstrate this, we would just have to dive into each city's history. And that's kind of the purpose of our City Unveiled videos. Literally a 5-hour documentary on a city, but for this instance, we can do Tampa. And shout out to Old World, Florida. There are the Ybor tunnels, where the mainstream story is that these are prohibition tunnels, and you'll see the same exact story in many other cities. One of the main proofs for Tartaria, and don't worry, we'll explain that word in a bit, but a good argument is these underground tunnels which can be found in almost every downtown American city. Some are small and may have been built in a more recent time, but others are massive and do not line up with the ability and available technology at the time. For example, the Washington Street Tunnel under the Chicago River. There are also legends in Pensacola of underground tunnels, yet they have been suppressed from the history books and have been left to oral history because they don't line up with the official PR-approved narrative. Look at this. The Henry B. Plant Museum, otherwise known as the Tampa Bay Hotel. Now to explain this to you, one of the aspects of Tartaria is stolen buildings and lost history. What you'll find is that every city has old world buildings. All you have to do is really question their history. Because if I were to tell you that I'm doubtful that they built this in the way that they tell us, meaning that this could be a repurposed building or an old world structure, most people would look it up and you would be directed to a museum that is in control of the history of that building and you'll be given a story. Most of the time, you'll get a few construction photos, but it's fascinating to find out how poorly documented the construction process was during this time in the early 19th century. It's the same thing. You'll see these buildings that are already mostly done with scaffolding, barely any people, windows in the ground, and clear signs of photo manipulation, which that's an entire subject of its own. Also in Tampa, there's the Ponce de Leon Hotel, which was completely poured concrete, which was supposedly the first of its kind. Also, these hotels in Florida were fully stocked with electricity during a time when Florida really didn't have that much going on, or so we're told. Also, you can see the familiar Russian-style architecture. Ever wonder why it's called St. Petersburg, Florida? Well, it's not just Florida. You can see this in New York, San Francisco, Charleston, St. Louis, and many more. Many times, old world churches downtown have questionable histories as being built or moved several times. You can see these old world buildings everywhere, from Gilded Age mansions and government buildings to small shops downtown. Even colleges, prisons, hospitals, military bases are all structures that do not line up with the official narrative that we are told. Of course, we're talking about structures from the 17th century to the 19th century in America. There's also no proof that they were built in the fashion that they tell us other than state-approved documents, manipulated photos, and just complete lies. There's also the common theme that throughout the downtowns of America, you can see what is often called mud-flooded windows. Of course, the typical answer is that these are just basements, but that doesn't really make that much sense. Some of these downtown areas get extreme flooding. Why would you build like this, especially with cities near the bay? Many of these basements actually have underground windows and doors that lead to nowhere. So this would imply that the streets actually used to be a lower level and then they were raised. We know this was done for a fact in Atlanta with the viaducts. They completely covered up old Atlanta. This is another interesting theme. Basically, many of these downtown cities in America have underground cities, which make no sense. What, did they just do a bunch of extra work for nothing? Put windows and doors and streets down there for the heck of it? It's more likely that there are lower levels of the cities in America that have been built over. And there is indeed evidence that there are massive tunnel systems underneath the majority of American cities. This alone should be enough to question the construction of these cities, as they didn't even have proper waste management until after the 1900s. They were literally defecating in chamber pots in the 1850s. What you have is that there's this complete contradiction with the culture, technology, and population counts needed to create these cities and buildings on this magnitude and scale in such a short time frame. They were building structures in the US in just a few years that were taking hundreds of years back in Europe. Let's keep in mind what we're discussing. Many of the downtowns in America have old world buildings that do not have an in-depth historical record. Some buildings have no construction photos at all, yet they feel very out of place for the time period that they're said to be built in. Again, if you want proof, that takes time, and we would have to list the buildings one by one as we've done in other videos. Because, again, in some cases we're talking about buildings from 200 years ago. It's not too hard to manipulate information over multiple generations. If we look at what was being taught in public schools just 50 years ago versus what's being taught now, there's really very little consistency. Why is it so crazy to question that the buildings that were being built all across America, even the ones from the early 1900s in some cases, and one of the things that Charlie demanded for was evidence. Evidence. Well, I agree. Where is the evidence that they built these old world buildings? Construction photos? You'd be surprised to know how many fake photos were used during war. Actually, all wars. Civil Wars, World War I and II both extensively use photo manipulations to reinforce the narratives being spread through newspapers and even radio. So I could just say I'm doubtful of those construction photos, in the same exact way that Moyse doubted the legitimacy of the 1540s map depicting castles in America. Yes, one is crayon, right? But it's quite clear that it's depicting castles in America in the 1540s and does not seem to be manipulated. Photos, yes, even construction photos, have been found to be complete fakes. There are other maps that show castles in America, including the early engravings of America depicting massive cities, but not only that, the 7 cities of Cibola from Joan Martinez's chart of 1578 is a map that depicts the 7 cities of Cibola, which were the mythical lands of gold that the Spanish believed to exist somewhere in the southwest of North America. Here is a depiction on the maps. Massive castle-like fortified cities. If you'd ask me, I trust these ancient manuscripts more than these low-quality construction photos given to us by some of these museums. Don't believe it? Is this photo of a Mormon construction site real? Most would automatically assume, since it's an old photo, that equals proof. But that's not true. It's a complete fabrication. Look at the vanilla skies. No faces? Floating ladder? They would paint on historic photos. We have an entire video exposing this history of photo manipulation. This would imply that they did not actually build these temples in such a short time span. The Mormons were said to have created multiple massive temple churches with no modern technology, and yet their photo manipulating photos And on top of that, you know the Book of Mormon actually says there were advanced civilizations in America before Columbus, and that they actually had cities here in America. Now I know there's a bunch of really crazy stuff in there. It might not be proof, but it's strange that they even mention that. How can we trust the history of these old world buildings when our historical record on many of these buildings is scarce? And you want to know the main reason why? Because there's been a great fire in every major American city, and I don't think that was by accident. Some people say, oh, it was because of candles, or that they didn't have enough resources to carry the water and put out the fire or whatever. But you know, they say that the Chicago fire was started by a cow kicking over a lantern that ended up causing over $200 million in damages. Which makes no sense. They were supposedly building these brick buildings to be entirely fireproof, so why do we see so many fires in Chicago, New York, Detroit, San Francisco, all over America? And let's not forget the World Fairs, which we'll explain in a bit. But they didn't have insurance back then. You think they were just building these massive brick buildings and underground tunnels all across America just to go in and actively destroy it with fire? And not all of them were accidents. During the Civil War, in Columbia, South Carolina, the Union specifically set the city on fire to destroy the buildings and mills so that they couldn't be used by the South. They did this with many other cities as well, which makes no sense because shortly after the Union came into possession of those lands. Now we're diving deep into this material. We're talking brotherhoods and fabrications of an unimaginable degree, mental mind control and population resets. You don't think that small groups of people in power aren't going to treat Earth and its inhabitants like a game of Sims or Civilization? The reason why we're not privy to this information is that these cities in America were literally founded. That's why they say that in history with the founding of a building or city. They're telling you and then redefining the words so that it doesn't seem like what it is. The next aspect of this alternative history involves secret societies. Yeah, Freemasons, and I know that many think that's a joke, right? But we aren't approaching this from your typical Illuminati Christian perspective, or not even from a conspiracy point of view, trying to blame everything on the evil Freemasons or something. No. Instead, we're discussing secret societies from a historical perspective. Go look up Oddfellows, then go to your downtown and notice how every downtown has or has had an Oddfellow lodge. If Freemason, Oddfellow, and Catholic Knight societies had lodges in every American city, is that not suspicious and or at least worthy of a note in the history books? Yes, obviously Freemasons and Oddfellows in the modern day are not the same thing that they were 100 years ago. Nowadays, if you go to a lodge, they're just a bunch of old people getting together and talking about life. But back in the day, they were doing all sorts of rituals. The Freemasons aren't the ones in control. Neither are the Oddfellows. They are the mind-controlled orphans ruled by the Venetian families. They are the top orphans of the club. Secret societies have always been prevalent in the Catholic Church. These Freemasons were called Knights, and they evolved into the modern groups that we know as Freemasons and what we know in the public today as the Illuminati. But the Freemasons are not the Illuminati or the people in control. These Catholic orphans in the 1700s that actually go back to earlier societies as the Rosicrucians and the Knights Templar, all of which were controlled by the church as pawns in the play of divide and conquer. So these Catholic orphans started their own society, the Oddfellows, to educate the orphan. And it's weird because they have these massive old world buildings with no construction photos that were also used as asylums and orphanages in many early American cities. They also contributed greatly to funding the schools and providing hospitals for a large amount of cities in America. These Oddfellows were just a bunch of odd fellows, and we're supposed to believe that they were just philanthropists giving all their money to the needy. That's the story they want you to believe. But this is when it gets dark. And this is all, according to the official story, factual. During the 1820 to 1950 period, there was an abundance of orphan trains that would move children from Europe all around the United States. They would do this to repopulate cities and use children for forced labor. This was going on before the 1800s, as before the Oddfellows there were the foundling hospitals. many of which have old world architecture and are quite massive. They were also used as sanitariums. Just to remind you, because yes, this does tie back to Tartaria, right now we're discussing orphans and brotherhoods because we're attempting to show you how history could easily be manipulated and or fabricated. We will come back to the buildings in just a moment. The Foundling Hospital logo clearly depicts Diana of Ephesus, the Queen Bee, and the Star of Ishtar. Now this is when we get into the importance of occult symbolism, another subject too in-depth to discuss in detail at the moment, but this is a clear reference to genetic cloning. We have an entire video on this subject, it's pretty mind-blowing. But the ancients and medieval alchemists were well aware of creating humans from within a tube. This process is actually described in detail by Paracelsus. Many of the most enlightened minds of the Renaissance period believed it to be possible to create a fully formed human without the use of sex. Also, the Cabbage Patch Kids from the 1980s are not just some crazy doll hype where people would beat each other up in order to get one. No, this concept of babies being grown in cabbages has a much darker history. We have a massive collection of French postcards from the early 1900s that depict children being grown and sold in cabbage patches. And no, it's not just a friendly, funny postcard. There were hundreds of these, and some of them are real photos of babies, most likely orphans. They're showing us through symbols the process of repopulation. We have proof of this because the first reference to cabbage patches in growing humans is actually from an 1896 film, which was the first movie ever made, La Fée aux Choux, by the female director Alice Guy. Go watch that movie and tell me it's not disturbing the way she threw around those babies. Alice Guy said herself that she made this film to promote the 1896 incubators at the World's Fair in Paris. So these World Fairs were used for selling children. They were literally called hatcheries, and there's even a postcard from the 1900s that showed this. Were they growing children in incubators for the process of repopulation? It's described in the artwork clearly. So what you have is empty cities, buildings that were founded, and these buildings were then found by a group of cult orphans that we call Freemasons basically, and they founded these orphanages and asylums for repopulating these cities. Then they fed us our history and even the rituals of the holidays. Many other mind control games that we play as children, like Pin the Tail on the Donkey, where we were actually secretly initiated into their club. And this phenomena of Tartaria, lost buildings, and civilizations is not just with the US. This is actually the same thing in every European city as well. It's everywhere, and this gets into the idea that Tartaria was a global civilization because many of these old world buildings that you see in America resemble European architecture. It's not just in America, you can find this exact same style of government buildings all around the world. I'll explain that soon, but I wanted to start with America because Charlie was saying, why would anyone look into this, that people just want to make stuff up for no reason. But I don't think you could easily make this stuff up, to be honest. I also think he doesn't fully understand what we're discussing, but I really don't blame him. There's still a lot of work to be done. The interesting thing about these buildings is that it's actually shocking to find out how bad the historical record is when it comes to the creation of many of these old world buildings in America. Also, not to mention the amount of buildings that were lost or destroyed to fires. It's important to understand our history, and if it's true that some of these buildings in America were actually here before the so-called settlers, then what would that imply? Would that mean that there was an advanced culture in America and that it wasn't just primitive Native Americans when the Europeans arrived like we're told? Now, I know that people who may be new and from his channel may think, okay, where's the evidence? I mean, come on, where's the evidence? And it's this automatic source type thinking that's honestly really limiting. That's not to say it's bad to source and document things, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying most of the time people are demanding some university approved mainstream sources, but when it comes to alternative history, many of the things we're discussing do not have an authorized answer because we're questioning and challenging histories that were set hundreds of years ago.